classify a volleyball spike, the university dictates that we need to consider a one-dimensional aspect of it when assessing performance. On the continuum, it's an open skill due to the fact that someone else has to set it in position for you, and then you have to get in the right position. It's also more discrete because there is a specific starting point and ending point. It's also more of a growth movement due to it requiring large muscle movements from the upper and lower body. Two-dimensionally, as we can see from the Gentiles taxonomy, is that it's classified as a 4D skill. This is due to body transport with an object, intertrial variability, and in-motion regulatory conditions where a ball, a net, and defenders are all variations that you need to be able to process. An analysis of the volleyball spike enabled us to compile a list of the most important physical aspects to carry out the skill. To measure performance, we use two measures. For quantitative data, which focuses on numerical statistics, we had the subject perform 4 trial spikes. We laid targets out across the ground and had a point scoring system for if they got it in the back court, the front court, or hit one of the targets. And after these 5 trials, they were combined to give a measurable base point. For qualitative data, which focuses on observable and descriptive data, we focused on how the subject performed the actual movement of the spike that was highlighted in the teaching points, with his jumping, feet placement, and how he hit the ball being the main focus aspects. Focusing on Fitz's 3 stages of learning, we can determine that the subject would be in the cognitive stage for the first 2 weeks, with the main points and exercises focused on understanding the basic aspects of the volleyball spike. We would be focusing on lots of verbal feedback as well. In the next 2 weeks, we'll be hoping to hit the associative stage, where the subject has become a lot more familiar with the motor skill, and we want to be highlighting how all the various individual skills that they've learned can all be interplayed to perform the gross motor skill, that is the volleyball spike. The last stage is an autonomous stage, where the subject can perform the spike while focusing on other aspects like defenders and where he's actually going to hit the ball, but due to the limited time that we have, the subject will not hit this level. We wanted the motor skill to become permanent in the subject's brain, so we focused on etching the skill into his long-term memory through encoding, which focuses on information from our sensory system and short-term memory system and combine them to help the body remember and retain the ability to perform the motor skill at a later date. For the width of attention, we got the client to have a narrow attention base for the first couple of weeks, focusing on one portion of the spike, to reduce complexity and to be able to focus on one thing at a time. And as the weeks progressed, we tried to make the subject's attention more broad, focusing on where he was on the court and where the defenders were on the other side. Due to there being no information about fostering positive transfer anywhere, bear with us on this one, but we related drills to past experiences and made it relatable and specific as possible to the subject. So it adds incentive to learn, but also the ability to relate it to the training and enjoy it will significantly increase attention and productivity for the subject. To give the subject some inclination of what we wanted the spike to look like, instructional training videos were shown to him just prior to commencing the session. This was due to a physical demonstration not being available. This was handy due to the fact that the subject had quite a good observation skills, and this was quite effective in teaching the skill. Explicit teaching was highlighted throughout the learning stage, and this was chosen due to the amount of physical variables being quite complex, and not performing them correctly and in a proper order can severely affect the efficiency of the spike. The subject was also shown his movements on video after he had completed the session, with feedback occurring while watching the video with the subject to highlight aspects that could be improved. Augmented feedback is defined as the performance information that the subject receives from an external source. It can be visual, like referring to an outcome of a skill, like hitting it over the net, or in relation to the actual movement, pushed off the ground hard to attain a good height. It can help inform the subject on what they could adjust. However, you don't want the subject to become too reliant on the feedback and therefore not seeing issues themselves, which will mean there will be limited transfer of skills to game situations. It's most effective when goals of the skill are unclear, and also when an intrinsic goal is not available to the subject. Feedback is crucial to learning, so we chose terminal feedback due to the client having to concentrate on so much during the actual session that the prospect of feedback throughout the session was going to be detrimental to performance. This occurred through watching a video of the subject performing the skills with the subject after the session, with the discussion hopefully resulting in a performance change for future sessions. To avoid a harmful dependency on the subject relying off feedback, we used a faded schedule to reduce feedback as quick as possible to build independence in the subject in relation to learning the motor skill. For the two types of motivational strategies, which are intrinsic, which is internal motivations, like getting a personal best, and extrinsic, external motivations, like impressing the good-looking girl on the sideline, we focused on intrinsic motivations. As we assessed, this was the most practical way to fuel the subject to perform to their optimal level, with studies showing that intrinsic motivation is much more effective for learning due to the fact that the client wants to be successful for themselves, which is the most important factor. At the start of week 1, we performed a pre-test using performance measures discussed previously. An identical post-test was administered to ensure validity was conducted at the end of week 6. To determine the extent of the level of performance that the subject actually received, a retention test was implemented a week after the post-test, using the same methods without any practice to assess if the subject can retain the knowledge of performing the skill. The transfer test was implemented straight after the retention test, and this focuses on the subject being able to adapt the skill in different scenarios of the sport. With a defender being introduced and someone setting up the ball for the spike, this was to mock a game situation and all the external variations that a game entails. The program contained 3 by 30-minute sessions per week, 15-minute drills, and 15 minutes with basic games such as horse for the first couple of weeks, then moving on to match play later in the latter couple of weeks, with a day break in between the first and second session and a 2-day break in between the second and third sessions, to evenly distribute the practices, as shorter and more frequent practices have been shown to develop learning more efficiently. Initially, the practice started out as blocked, which focuses on the subject repeating movements associated with the spike over and over to help them understand the movement patterns behind it. Then after weeks 2, we tried to shift the training style to random, where we put the skills together to help the subject be on their toes and not fall in a repetitive routine. Due to the volleyball spike having quite a few variables involved, the first 2 weeks were focused on part practices, which involved breaking down the skill and practicing part of the movement, as the name suggests. But we identified that although part was necessary, we wanted to get the whole practice as soon as possible, due to the fact that we didn't want the subject to get too comfortable with performing quite small basic movements, when the aim is to have multiple actionings happening at once in regards to moving the feet and upper body all in conjunction with each other. The spike is quite complex and physically demanding, so whole practice was decided as the main aspect once the basics of the motor skill had been taught. The teaching points were simplified into verbal cues, so they were clear and concise for the subject, with the aim of avoiding complication but reaffirming key aspects of the skill, with the hope of saying no more than 8 words and the subject understanding what was needed to be performed. For week 1, we focused on basic volleyball skills, just to familiarise the subject with the ball and other aspects of volleyball, including digging, setting and serving. To break up the session, we incorporated a couple of games, including the subject counting how many times he could keep the ball up in the air to keep it fun. For week 2, we decided to start getting a bit more specific, working on the techniques of the spike and focusing on getting the arm close to the ear, with the primary focus this week on the physical characteristics of the upper body in a spike. Week 3 focused on jumping technique and lower body movements during the spike, identifying the correct technique of left foot, right foot, then planting both together and jumping, with no ball being used during the skill session due to the technique being the most critical point of the spike. After the session, we played some games with digging and setting to break it up, but also to keep developing the subject's other volleyball skills. For week 4, we combined what the subject learned in both weeks 2 and 3, so the subject was performing the whole technique of the spike. For week 5, we introduced a net and someone throwing the ball up. For week 6, we focused primarily on match play, We wanted to give the subject some incentive to show.
Love is policy, y'all. Alright, get this party started, y'all. DJ Smash.